Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we are breaking down the Saturday DFS main slate for college football for Saturday, November 25th, 2023. This is week 12 of the college football season, and this is the second big-time DFS slate that we've got here in week 12. So if you were looking for the Friday episode, scroll back a little bit on the episode feed if you're listening on audio, or look back a few videos on the YouTube channel because we did do a Friday episode. This is, there's two big-time slates this week, with it being Thanksgiving weekend. And this is really the last big time slate that we've got before bowl season. So this one should be a fun one. Got a lot of games to target, a lot of guys that we can get into our lineups. But if you are looking for the Friday slate, maybe you're looking to get it in before Friday, go listen to that one and then come back and check this one out before you make your lineups for the Saturday slate. So we got you covered here for the Saturday slate. Make sure that you subscribe to the podcast because we are going to be covering college football DFS throughout the remainder of conference championship season and bowl season. And also, we are currently a three-sport podcast. We're going to have episodes that are for the NFL and college basketball as well as college football. So hit that subscribe button. You'll be notified when new episodes drop. Subscribe to the audio feed as well on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, wherever you get your podcasts from, because some episodes are going to be audio only. So if you subscribe to the YouTube channel and subscribe to the audio feed, then you just will never miss a beat, never miss an episode. So highly recommend doing both those. But that does it for the introduction. Let's go ahead and get started breaking things down here on this Saturday main slate. All right, so let's kick things off by taking a look at the games that we're going to want to target for our DFS lineups. So it's weird because in real life, like as a real college football fan, the game of the slate is going to be Ohio State, Michigan, right? The game, which has turned into the best rivalry in all of college football. And even as a Texas fan, I kind of got to begrudgingly admit that this rivalry has surpassed Texas, Oklahoma. Every year, this game comes in with big-time playoff implications for one of these two teams, and it usually does not disappoint in terms of the quality of the game. So this is the game that everybody's going to be watching, but I think that it's actually not that great of a game to target for DFS. The total is only 46.5. Michigan's 3.5-point favorites, so not really projected to be a whole lot of points scored in this one, but there are some other games on the slate where there are some points that are projected to be scored. There's no shootouts in the traditional sense as I've defined them all season, but there are quite a few blowouts. We've got a lot of teams that are implied to score over 30 points on this slate, so let's go ahead and take a look at all of those. So the first game of the day where you've got a team implied over 30 is UCF taking on Houston. UCF's 13.5-point favorites. Total is at 61.5 right now, so Houston is implied to win this one about 38-24. UCF is implied to win this one about 38-24. Big time favorites for the Knights of Central Florida. They are a very run heavy team, and I expect that they're going to be getting that ground game going as 13.5-point favorites. Next up, you have LSU taking on Texas A&M. This line has actually been bet down a little bit. They were 11.5-point favorites when I took my notes. Now they're only 10.5-point favorites, but they are projected to win this one more or less about 39-27. I guess now 39-28 with it, coming down a point. But LSU is one of the highest scoring teams on the slate. They're one of the best offenses on any slate that they're on. Last year, this game was a little bit of an upset. It was Texas A&M that won 38-23. And in that game, LSU quarterback Jayden Daniels only accounted for 15 fantasy points. All three LSU touchdowns were rushing touchdowns by running backs. So not great history against Texas A&M for Jayden Daniels. The other one we got to talk about is Colorado taking on Utah. And look, Colorado, as much hype as they had in the month of September, as good as they looked, they are very much limping to the finish line here. They're very banged up, got a lot of injuries, and just not looking good these last few weeks. They are currently 20-point underdogs to Utah. This game is projected to be about 37 to, actually not that much, 35-15 in favor of Utah is about what this spread is looking like. The line on this has actually gone down since I last took my notes. That's why I had 37-15 in favor of Utah. So with a lot of guys banged up for Colorado, very much limited to the finish. It's a home game for Utah where they're very tough to beat. Not very optimistic for the Colorado Buffaloes in that one. Another one that we do have is Arizona taking on Arizona State. This one actually has sneaky shootout potential. It is projected to be Arizona over Arizona State by about 30-20 in terms of a score. However, the two highest scoring teams on the slate are not exactly who you might think. One of them is Tennessee. They're projected to beat Vanderbilt 42-15. That is the second highest team total on the slate, but the highest team total belongs to Washington, taking on Washington State. They are projected to win this one 43-26. That is the highest individual individual team total on the slate. Last year, this game was 51-33 in favor of Washington. So we know that both these teams can put up points, and we know that there is a high possibility that there's a lot of points in the Apple Cup here on Saturday. All right, now let's go ahead and switch gears a little bit and break things down at the quarterback position. So when it comes to building your lineups, Jayden Daniels is the guy that the entire slate is going to revolve around. He is currently priced at $11,000 on DraftKings, and he's been the best quarterback in all of college fantasy football all season long, in all of DFS college football all season long. He's been the absolute best quarterback. And he's been over 26 fantasy points in every game this season, so he's got an elite floor, and he's got an elite ceiling, right? He's had back-to-back games over 65 fantasy points, which is just a wild statement to utter. But we play a game that comes down to salary and fantasy points, right? So if you're going to be spending $11,000 on Jayden Daniels, is that going to be worth it? Well, we've talked about before how you want at least 3 times value, 3 points per $1,000 of salary if you want to maybe get a min cash in a GPP or win in a cash game, and you want 4 times fantasy points per $1,000 in salary if you want to make big money in GPP. Well, Jayden Daniels at $11,000, he would need 33 fantasy points to hit 3 times value, and he's done that in 9 of his 11 games. He would need 44 fantasy points to get 4 times value, and he's done that in 4 of 11 games. That's not a bad number. So the question becomes, if you put Jayden Daniels in, do you need to play a second quarterback even? Because last week on the Saturday night slate with LSU taking on Georgia State, what we saw out of Jayden Daniels was he was so good and put up 65 fantasy points, and none of the other quarterbacks really gave you a whole lot of value, that the best strategy on the slate was to grab Jayden Daniels, grab Malik Neighbors, and go with a whole bunch of flex options from there and not play a quarterback in the super flex. Usually, I pretty much by default play a quarterback in the super flex, but after how last week played out, I'm contemplating throwing in a few lineups here and there this week where it's Jayden Daniels and it's not a second quarterback in the super flex, so that way I can make room for better skill position players along the way. Now, the next quarterback is going to be Michael Penix Jr. And look, I got to be honest, I don't think anybody is going to play Michael Penix Jr. this week. He's only $600 cheaper than Jayden Daniels. And so why wouldn't you just go pay up for Jayden Daniels, a guy who has shown much better floor and much better ceiling over the course of the season than Michael Penix Jr. So Michael Penix Jr. would need 31.2 fantasy points to just hit 3 times value for his current salary, and that's a mark that he's hit only once in his last 5 games. But the good news is that his team's projected 43 points in this one, and so if Washington's going to put up 43 points, that's going to mean some touchdowns for Michael Penix Jr. And anytime his team scores 42 or more real points, Michael Penix Jr. has averaged 31.5 DraftKings fantasy points. So you're looking at a situation here where if Washington does end up scoring a whole lot of points, maybe it's Michael Penix that ends up getting there. But I don't see anybody honestly sitting down to build their lineups and thinking, you know what, I would rather have Michael Penix Jr. than Jayden Daniels. So I think Michael Penix is going to be super low owned. I think he has less upside than Jayden Daniels, but I could see a scenario where he does outscore him and end up being the slate's best play at quarterback. Now, speaking of a guy who could outscore Jayden Daniels, Jalen Milroe has a supremely high ceiling. So throwing out the Chattanooga game, his last 2 SEC games were 42 and 51 fantasy points, and he totaled 7 rushing touchdowns in those games. So Jalen Milroe, if he has a ceiling game, it's going to come with his legs being a primary factor of it, with scoring touchdowns with his legs being a primary factor of it. So I think he's the one expensive quarterback that you can play unstacked without a wide receiver or running back accompaniment, just because Jalen Milroe, if he were to have his best game, is going to do so by the use of his legs, where nobody else is getting fantasy points if Jalen Milroe is getting it by his legs. So I really do like Jalen Milroe. I think he's a guy who does have the upside to outscore Penix and Daniels, and I think that he gives you a little bit more flexibility with your lineup than those two, because he's about $1,000 cheaper on DraftKings, and he will he can be played unstacked, so you can free up another position, to kind of save some salary at. So I really do like Jaylen Milroe for this slate. Now, Auburn did just play another very mobile quarterback, Diego Pavia, one of my favorites to play on the midweek Conference USA action earlier in the season. But Diego Pavia only put up 35 rushing yards against Auburn. So it's not necessarily boding well for Jaylen Milroe to have a ceiling rushing game, but I do like Jaylen Milroe. If I were to rank these top 3 quarterbacks, I would probably have it Daniels, Milroe, and then Penix as to how much I am going to play each of those 3 guys. Now, I'm skipping the next few quarterbacks because Shedeur Sanders is banged up going against a great defense. J.J. McCarthy going up against a great defense, and that team has shown the absolute disregard for passing the football in recent weeks. So let's go ahead and talk about Cam Ward. So Cam Ward is a boom or bust option. You look at his game log, and he has multiple games where he's had over 30 fantasy points and multiple games where he's had single-digit fantasy points. You don't know what you're going to get with Cam Ward, but in a game that's projected to be a shootout and go back and forth, he does give you an ability to have a high point total at $8,800. Next up, I'm going to talk about two quarterbacks from the same game. John Rice Plumley and Donovan Smith. They're taking on each other in the Houston UCF matchup this week, and I like both of them. John Rice Plumley was injured in the middle of the season, and he's averaged 24.6 fantasy points since returning from injury. That's an average of 3 times value for his salary, and he's had at least 45 yards rushing in 4 straight. So he's seeing no lingering effects of that injury. He's able to run just like he used to. And that rushing upside is big time. And if this game does end up being a shootout, we've already talked about how UCF's 14-point favorites, then John Rice Plumley could absolutely get there. However, Donovan Smith is a guy that if I'm playing John Rice Plumley, I'm probably going to be playing Donovan Smith on the other side of it just because Smith is like the king of shootouts. And when he gets in a shootout with his team, he generally plays very well. We talked about this stat last week, but the Oklahoma State game added another example of this. All of Smith's best games this season have come during shootouts. He now has scored 25 or more fantasy points 6 times in 11 games this season. And all 6 of those times, the other team has scored at least 24 points against Houston. All 6 of those times, there have been at least 49 points scored in the game. So if there's a shootout being played, Donovan Smith is going to get you at least 25 fantasy points. And it also means that somebody on the other side scoring some fantasy points as well. So I really do like the Plumley Smith combo at quarterback. And even if I'm playing Donovan Smith, I might not necessarily play Plumley, but I'm probably going to want to get another piece of the UCF offense. Now, next up, we got to talk about Joe Milton. And he has not been one of my favorite options in DFS all season long, but I kind of like him this week because Tennessee's implied to score 42 points against Vanderbilt. Well, how the heck is Tennessee going to score 42 points and their quarterback not account for some of it, right? So I think that just naturally Joe Milton is going to have some involvement here and going to have to put up some touchdowns and put up some numbers. And when you look at games this season where Tennessee has scored 40 or more fantasy points, where Tennessee has scored 40 or more real points, in fantasy points, Joe Milton has scored 24.9, 12, 31.3, and 31.3, which is not terrible. Like two out of 4 times, that's 31.3 points, which would be really good at $7,500. But those 4 games, that's an average of 24.9 fantasy points. So I would be absolutely okay with that. Willing to play Joe Milton and okay with that at his salary of $7,500. Now, next up is going to be Bryson Barnes of Utah, and he gets the dream matchup this week. Colorado's defense is banged up. They haven't been good all season, and they're just very much limping to the finish line, like we mentioned in the opener. And Bryson Barnes has been a sneaky good fantasy option. He's put up 28 fantasy points in 2 of his last 3. That would be 4 times value for his salary he's currently at. And so with a dream matchup coming, and with the passing volume being there for Bryson Barnes, I really think that this is a pretty good spot for him. And I think that he is a sneaky play at only $7,100. I think he's a quarterback that you can put in as your second quarterback if you're playing a guy like Daniels, Penix, or Milroe at the top that gives you a little bit of salary that you can save for the rest of your lineup. Now, there are 2 more bargain quarterbacks who I would put in that category who are cheaper than Bryson Barnes. And the first one is going to be Jaylen Henderson of Texas A&M. Against Mississippi State, he had 32 fantasy points in his first start. Now, Mississippi State's defense isn't all that good, but neither is LSU's. LSU's defense is one of the worst in all the Power 5 conferences, in my opinion, right up there with the likes of USC and Colorado. So I think that this is a prime opportunity for Jaylen Henderson to find himself in a shootout with Jaden Daniels, at least for a half or 3 quarters, and come through with a big-time fantasy performance from that. Now, what I like about Jaylen Henderson also is that he has 12 rushing attempts in both games that he started, and really he did not play the full game against Abilene Christian. But, 12 rushing attempts in both games. LSU has a definite weak point at defending mobile quarterbacks. We saw that with Jalen Milroe earlier this month, so I think that this is a prime spot for Jaylen Henderson. Max Johnson, A&M's former starter, is listed as questionable for this game, and he's considered day-to-day. We don't really know what the situation is, but I'll be honest, I would be more interested in Henderson if Johnson is out. then I would be interested in Johnson if Johnson is playing. I really like the rushing upside that Henderson gives you as opposed to just kind of the quarterback play that Max Johnson has given over the last 2 months. Now, the other bargain quarterback is going to be BYU's quarterback, Jake Rettl. And this is, obviously assuming that Keaton Slovis is going to be out, but Retzlaff just put up 20 fantasy points against Oklahoma, and Oklahoma State's defense I don't think is as good as Oklahoma's. So $5,900, you're getting a guy who's going to throw the ball a lot, who's going to have plenty of opportunities, and just did put up a solid value performance. So I definitely don't mind going with old Jake Retzlaff this week. All right, that does it for the quarterback position. Let's go ahead and take a quick break, and then let's talk about the running backs. Now, before we get started with the running back position, I do want to mention there are a few places that you can get more information from me. First off, you can follow me on X at Mike's Money Picks. I tweet out the DFS rundown for every college football slate, going over some of my favorite categorical plays for each slate, and I do that for college football and college basketball. I also tweet out if there's any injury news that kind of updates my thoughts on players. I do try my best to get it out as well. I am a dad of a 2-month-old right now, so I've been a little bit busy, but I do try to get my stuff out there on X. Also, if there's any updates with the episodes, being on YouTube or being audio only and whatnot, I get them out there for you as well. So give me a follow at Mike's Money Picks on X. I'm also in the Fantasy Corner Discord. Link is in the description on YouTube and on the audio feed. On the Fantasy Corner Discord, we've got a lot of smart people in there who play a lot of different DFS sports. It's entirely free. We've got DFS players of all levels that we get a lot of good discussion, just bouncing ideas off each other, thinking about plays, thinking about ownership, stuff like that. And it really does help. It's helped me become a better NBA DFS player because we got a lot of smart people in there. But college football, college basketball, NFL, NBA, it's all happening in the Discord. Link is in the description. And then also I do write a full article for Patreon for every college football and college basketball DFS slate where I highlight my core plays as well as kind of my lineup strategy and my attack strategy for the slate. I'm not just going to sit here and say that, you'll instantly win GPPs by reading those articles, but I do think that it can give you a lot of information as you build your own lineups and definitely help give you guys a strategy that you can use to be successful in college football and college basketball DFS, because that's, two sports that aren't really super covered right now in the DFS world. And I do think I get a lot of information out there that can help people get better at those two sports. And lastly, if you were looking to try anything new this college football season, head on over to signupexpert.com/Mike's Picks. I'm partnering with Sign Up Expert, and what they do is they give you the best promo codes and offers for new users on sportsbook, DFS, and player prop sites. So if you're looking to try something new, head on over there. You'll get yourself a great offer and a great promo code. And it'll also help me out by using my links. I know I'm in North Carolina right now, so on January 1st, when sports betting becomes legal, that's the first place I am headed to register for all these new sports books that are available in my state. All right, so let's go ahead and now break down the running back position. So this running back slate to me is very stratified. I think there are a lot of great pay-up options at running back, and I think there are a lot of great values at running back. I don't really think there's a whole lot of mid-range plays at running back. So I'm going to kind of let my strategy at quarterback as I'm building my lineups dictate what I'm going to do at the running back position. If I am paying up at quarterback, I'm going to backfill it with some values at running back and vice versa. If I'm playing a mid-range or a cheap quarterback, I'm going to invest in these, big dogs at running back. So let's go ahead and talk about the big dogs. So you've got Ollie Gordon II, who has been the best running back in college football DFS for the last 2 months now, excluding the one dud game against UCF. He has been spectacular. We don't really need to get into specifics about how spectacular he has been, but DraftKings has now finally priced him up to where he should be, and FanDuel has got him priced up to about where he should be. Now, I'm still playing him. I think $9,000 on DraftKings is a very reasonable price for him, if I'm being honest. BYU is not a great not a great run defense. It is a great matchup for Ollie Gordon. So BYU's run defense gives up an average of 186 rushing yards per game. And a team like Oklahoma State, they're going to run the ball a little bit more than average, and they're projected to win this game by double digits. So they're going to be running the ball. The game flow is going to dictate that they're going to run the ball. So if they're giving up 186 rushing yards, I think that number can be a little bit higher to Oklahoma State. They also give up an average of 5 yards a carry, of which Ollie Gordon has exceeded 3 out of his last 5 games quite easily. So you're thinking with Ollie Gordon here, He's a lock to get about 25 carries, which is essentially going to turn into 125 yards against this BYU defense. And you got to feel like if Oklahoma State's scoring touchdowns, Ollie Gordon's going to count for a few of those as well. So I just think he's an absolutely great play. I absolutely see the pathway for him to get 3 times and 4 times value for even his pricey salary right now at $9,000. I really like Ollie Gordon, and I'm not afraid to pay up to play. Blake Corum, to me, is an interesting play. He's starting to get more consistent usage as Michigan has finally started to get tested in this season. You know, the first 8 games, they pretty much just walloped whoever was in their path and didn't really have to play that hard in the second half because the game was already over. Well, in the Penn State Maryland games, they had dogfights. And what they did in those dogfights was they leaned on the ground game and leaned on Blake Corum. He had 26 and 28 attempts in both of those games, average of 27. And you got to feel like their biggest game of the season, they're going to lean on Blake Corum again. Now, what I also think is interesting is the dynamics in this game are very interesting. I think Michigan is going to try to win this game by running the ball. I don't think Ohio State will be able to run the ball, so I think Ohio State's path to victory is by passing the ball and being effective in that regard. So Corum, if they really do commit to the run, Michigan has kind of worn down Ohio State on the ground in each of the last 2 victories over them. Last year, Donovan Edwards had 216 yards and 2 touchdowns. The previous year, Hassan Haskins had 169 yards and 5 touchdowns against Ohio State. So Michigan has kind of had the answer in the ground game in this rivalry. And I see Blake Corum as a play who his floor is about even with Ollie Gordon. Might not have the same ceiling as Ollie Gordon, but if he comes in a lot lower owned, I could see a pathway to Blake Corum outscoring Ollie Gordon and helping a lot of people out in their lineups if he is able to come in as the lower owned, lower priced play who does in fact outscore Ollie Gordon. Now, the next guy that I do like is RJ Harvey of UCF. So I mentioned this at the top, but Houston tends to find themselves in a lot of shootouts. And if UCF is going to be scoring points, you got to feel like RJ Harvey is going to be one of the guys scoring points. Houston just gave up 164 rushing yards to Ollie Gordon. You got to feel like RJ Harvey is going to be able to do the same. He's averaging 34.8 fantasy points in his last 3 games. He's had at least 20 carries in all 3 of those games. And you're looking at a guy who has a big-time workload, who is going up against a mediocre Russian defense and is a double-digit favorite, so the game flow sets up nicely for RJ Harvey. So I see myself playing a lot of RJ Harvey if I'm not paying up for Gordon or Corum. I think he provides you similar upside at a much cheaper price tag. And I see myself playing a lot of Donovan Smith at quarterback, RJ Harvey at running back, and getting my exposure to this Houston UCF game that way, and still having a lot of salary to build out the rest of my lineup after. Jinn Jackson is the next guy we're going to talk about. He's a way down the list. Like I said, I'm not that interested in a lot of the mid-range plays on this slate. So Jinn Jackson is the running back at Utah. He came on strong at the end of last season. He was a converted quarterback. He busted out in November with a bunch of big-time plays. And this year has been kind of a disappointment overall for him, but he's been super banged up. Hasn't really gotten going consistently as the year's going on. But now he's finally starting to kind of get his rhythm back. He's not been super explosive, but he has been effective on the ground. He's been scoring touchdowns on the ground in recent weeks. And I think this Colorado matchup is exactly what the doctor ordered. From the very start of the season, when this team gave up over 150 rushing yards to Imani Bailey of TCU, Colorado became a rushing defense that I wanted to target in DFS. And that's kind of been something that's worked for the most part, because even if the rushing defense hasn't been something to target, the passing defense has been something to target. So Jinn Jackson, I think, has a dream matchup. He's getting a solid workload, a solid price tag, only $5,300. I think he gives a lot of versatility if he's the guy that you plug in and play at the running back position with this dream matchup coming this Saturday. Next up is going to be Jaylen Wright of Tennessee. And look, to me, he's the Tennessee back that you want. Yes, they play 3 of them. They play Sampson and Small as well. But Wright has been the best of them recently. In the last 3 games, he has led the team in carries in each of those 3 games. He's led the team in yards in each of the last 3 games. He's led the team in fantasy points in each of the last 3 games. At the running back position, So you're looking at a guy that he's the best running back to play. Tennessee's projected to score 42 points. Why not go ahead and plug him and play him and hope that he gets 2 of those touchdowns that they're going to need on that pathway to 42 points? I really like Jaylen Wright. Look, if you can break off a 75-yard run against Georgia, then you can certainly do that against Vanderbilt, and that's really all he needs to pay off value. So Jaylen Wright, definitely a guy that I'm going to be playing a lot of as a paydown option at the running back position. LJ Johnson is another guy that I'm going to talk about. So he is a part of the SMU offense that is the I say this kindly, the most socialist offense in all of college football. They balance their production out among so many players at every position that even though they're a good offense, they're very hard to pin down in DFS and play guys off of that offense. So LJ Johnson, though, in back-to-back weeks, he's seen 20 plus carries. He scored 20 plus fantasy points, and SMU's a double-digit favorite taking on Navy in this one. The guy who is listed as the starter at the start of the season, he's the Miami transfer, Jaywen Knighton. He's listed as probable for this game, but I still think even if he does end up playing, LJ Johnson's kind of been outperforming him and out carrying him in the last 3 weeks anyway. So LJ Johnson is definitely a guy that I have a lot of interest in at only $4,800. Like I said from the top of this running back position, there's a lot of guys that I would consider values that I'm very much willing to play in my lineups this week. One of the last ones is going to be Rodney Hammond Jr. of Pitt. He's another guy who has kind of had a disappointing season. Coming in, he was Izzy Abanaconda's backup last year. And there was high hopes for him coming in and finally being able to take over as the lead back, and he just never really did until last week against Boston College when he had 15 carries for 145 yards and a touchdown, 23.5 fantasy points, which was his high on the season by about 6 fantasy points. So if this backfield is finally RJ or Rodney Hammond's, then I think he's got the potential for a pretty big day, right? Like going up against the Duke run defense that is not great, but not terrible. I'm just willing to invest in a guy that is his team's RB1 at $4,500 and just showed what his upside was last week. Now, the last guy that I'm going to talk about for sure that I'm willing to play is going to be Aiden Robbins of BYU. So Aiden Robbins is a UNLV transfer into BYU. How's that for a transfer, by the way? You go from Las Vegas to Brigham Young. That's interesting. Anyway, you got a guy that is now his team's RB1. Total 22 carries against Oklahoma last week, 182 yards in that game. And BYU playing with a backup quarterback, they've shown kind of the tendency to lean on that run game when it's Jake Retzlaff starting at quarterback. So I really like the fact that Aiden Robbins is going to get a lot of carries. He's only scored once this season, and I kind of think he's due for another one. So only $4,100 taking on Oklahoma State. I really think that I'm willing to buy into Aiden Robbins this week and bank on that he's going to get some touchdown regression and he's going to get a big time workload. Now, the last guy that I'm going to talk about is kind of a conditional play. So Washington's Dylan Johnson is very questionable for this game. Will Nixon figures to be the guy that would be the starter if Dylan Johnson were to miss. And Will Nixon is only $3,400. Like, you're talking about a starting running back for one of the best offenses in all of college football. Projected to score over 40 points at only $3,400. I think that's something I would be very much interested in, but it would need to be Dylan Johnson declared out. And unfortunately, this is the last game of the slate, so your options for late swap would be very, very limited if you were to rely on Will Nixon being your starting running back. So that's definitely a risky proposition. I would hope that before Saturday we have better news on Dylan Johnson, but if we don't get that news, then Will Nixon becomes a contingency play that would be very good, but also very difficult to late swap out of if you are relying on it. All right, that does it for the running back position. So let's go ahead and take a quick breather, and then let's talk about the wideouts. All right, so before we go ahead and talk about the wide receiver position, I do want to go ahead and give this quick mention. So if you are watching on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button and hit the like button. It shows me a lot more support than you could ever know, and I really do appreciate it. And we're closing in on 250 subscribers, so every little bit helps. Go ahead and hit that button if you like what you're seeing on this video, and you'll get notified when all our new episodes drop for the rest of college football season, as well as NFL and college basketball. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about the wide receivers. So more so than ever now that we're late in the season, I think stacking your receivers with your quarterback is the best strategy. Simply because now we have so many numbers when it comes to targets and catches and fantasy points that we kind of know what's going to happen with these teams' passing games, and we know what's going to happen if a quarterback has a big game, which receivers are going to come along with them. So let's go ahead and kick things off by talking about the highest priced receiver on the slate, which is Malik Neighbors of LSU. So he's been the best fantasy wide receiver in college football all season. Notice I said fantasy because Marvin Harrison Jr. is the best real wide receiver I have seen in college football in a long, long time. But anyway, from a fantasy perspective, Malik Neighbors has outperformed him. So he's incredibly expensive on DraftKings. He's incredibly expensive on FanDuel as well. He really puts a crunch on your lineup, especially if you are stacking him with Jayden Daniels. And I don't think I would play Malik Neighbors without Jayden Daniels, simply because I think if Neighbors were to have a big game, it would mean that Daniels is having a big game as well. So I would only play them both together. But The question is how can we get there with his salary being 9,600? I'll be honest, I am struggling with this one. He's only eclipsed 4 times value for his salary once all season for his current price tag. It was when he had 51.9 fantasy points against Mississippi State. Noted bad defense at Mississippi State. So I just don't really see a pathway for the winning GPP lineup to be a Daniels neighbor stack. What I do see, however, is a pathway for it to happen with Daniels and one of his other receivers, Brian Thomas or Kyron Lacy. So Brian Thomas is $1,600 cheaper than Malik Neighbors. And he has shown a similar ceiling to Malik Neighbors. He has a 40 fantasy point performance under his belt. That's 5 times value for his current salary. To me, it's just less likely that he has like the big slate breaking game than Malik Neighbors, but it's $1,600 less. You don't need it as often as you would from Malik Neighbors. So on the season, Brian Thomas is at 4 times value for his current salary in 3 of 11 games and 3 times value in 6 of 11 games. Both of those numbers are better than Malik Neighbors. So I really do think playing Brian Thomas as your stacking partner for Jayden Daniels is a very viable strategy. Even if Neighbors ends up outscoring Thomas, I think that Thomas could still end up being a better per dollar play. Now, Kyron Lacy is the guy who could break it from both of them. He's only $5,300, and he came through last week against Georgia State with a 30.1 fantasy point performance. He also has another earlier this season of 24. So I think that you could legitimately play lineups with Jayden Daniels where you play one with Neighbors, one with Thomas, and one with Lacy. I know when I was testing out builds earlier, I liked where I was at with Lacy more than the other two, simply because it didn't put so much of a crunch on the rest of the guys that I could play. And he's shown that 30 fantasy point upside, even with a much cheaper price tag. So I think that's the decision that you got to make this week is who to stack Daniels with. And like I said, I think my early lean is towards Kyron Lacy, even though as I'm building out my lineups, like I said before, I'm generally a guy who plays 20 max lineups, and I would have a little bit of Neighbors, I would have a little bit of Thomas, and I will have a little bit of Lacy. But I think Lacy is my favorite stacking partner for Jayden Daniels at the moment. Now, on the Texas A&M side of things have gotten very messy in this receiving corps since Evan Stewart came back from injury. And Jaylen Henderson is the quarterback. He's a guy who runs more than throws. So you're getting a little bit less volume for these wide receivers in general. Ainias Smith has been the guy who has been operating as the wide receiver one pretty much through the second half of this season. So if I were to play one A&M receiver, he would be the guy that I would want. In fact, if I were to play any A&M skill player on this offense that I think is still going to be able to score some points this weekend, Ainias Smith would probably be that guy. Very reasonably priced at only $5,500 on DraftKings. Now, let's go ahead and talk about Ohio State. So I mentioned this game earlier, and I thought that, Michigan's path to victory is by running the football. Ohio State's path to victory is by passing. Well, would it shock anybody if Marvin Harrison Jr. just went out there and broke the slate tomorrow or on Saturday? Excuse me. I say tomorrow, but I'm recording this on a Thursday. That's the funny part. Would it surprise anybody if Marvin Harrison Jr. broke the slate? It would not surprise me at all because he's in a position where he can just get absolutely fed. And if that happens, then he is shown the ability. He can rack up 40 fantasy points in a game in a hurry. And so he's also a guy I'm willing to play without Kyle McCord because Kyle McCord has shown the ability to not have ceiling games while Marvin Harrison is having one because all of McCord's points are from Marvin Harrison Jr. and you get more points for receiving yards than passing yards. So I'm willing to play Marvin Harrison all alone from this game. I think that a very interesting strategy would be like a Corum Harrison build where you just hope that this game shoots out and those two superstars are the guys who are causing all the fantasy points. Harrison Jr. is the only receiving option I would play from this game, given Michigan's ability to just totally neglect the forward pass. But Cade Stover, I think, for Ohio State is an intriguing dart throw at only $4,500. You don't have to pay a whole lot for him, and he's been double-digit fantasy points pretty much every game he's caught a pass this season. He's got the double-digit fantasy points. So I don't mind Cade Stover at only $4,500, but that's the only other passing option I would consider in this football game. Now, Washington State is a tale of two teams. So you have Rome Odunze for Washington, where he is the safest, most consistent stacking partner with Michael Penix Jr. He is kind of like Michael Penix Jr.'s Malik Neighbors. He has a super high ceiling. He has shown the ability to hit value, like very solid play with Rome Odunze. If I'm playing Penix, I'm playing Odunze with him. However, the other two guys there have some red flags, Jalen Polk and Jalen McMillan. So last week, both of these guys played against Utah. I'm sorry, not against Utah. Their last game was Oregon State. Both these guys played against Oregon State, but neither of them recorded a catch. Both of them had a goose egg. That is not a good sign, like at all, that these guys played a full game and had a goose egg. What it shows to me is that McMillan being back in the lineup has affected Jalen Polk's workload, but has not affected Rome Odunz's workload. So I'm willing to go back to O'Dunes. Polk and McMillan, I will catch y'all back up on conference championship week or in bowl season, but I'm not going back to either of those two guys after they just got a goose egg where we don't know how their snap shares are going to play out, and you got to pay over $6,000 to find out. Yeah, miss me with that. So Rome Odunze is the Washington receiver that I will be stacking with Michael Penix Jr. Now, on the Washington State side of things, they're pretty simple. Like, they're really simple. You've got Lincoln Victor, Kyle Williams, and Josh Kelly. And from the three of them, they're going to combine for about 50 fantasy points. How it's distributed is up to them. We don't really know how it's going to be distributed, but you know that on a game-to-game basis, that's pretty much what you're going to get from them in total. So if you're playing Cam Ward, just pick two of the pieces that you like. From what we've seen so far this season, Victor has shown the highest floor. He has the most consistent target share, but all three of them have shown a pretty high ceiling. So if you're playing Cam Ward, you can pair up Victor, Williams, and Kelly. Play one of them, play two of them. I think that either of those is a viable strategy. If Cam Ward is to get there, then one or two of those wide receivers is going to come with him. Looking down the board, I'm not interested in anybody for Louisville. I'm not interested in anybody for Colorado. For Arizona State, the list is pretty short as well. For Arizona and Arizona State, the list is pretty short. So for Arizona, Jacob Cowing was not 100% in kind of the last two games at least for Arizona, and he's not been great in either of them. What you have seen is that Teteroa McMillan has came on and had a breakout performance since then. He had 28.7 against Colorado, 33.4 against Utah. That's averaging about 31 per game in those two games. And so McMillan has kind of been the breakout star in the last few weeks. If Cowing is still showing some lingering effects of that injury, McMillan can continue to go off against an Arizona State defense that is just not that good. On the Arizona State side of things, they do have one target monster, that is Elijah Badger. He has combined for 28 targets in his last two games, which is just an absurd number. Like, that's like 2021 Cooper Kupp numbers, like how many targets he's gotten. So if you are somebody who trusts in targets as a predictable fantasy stat, he's a guy that you got to like at only $5,700. Arizona State's projected to score about 20 points in this game, so meaning they're going to get 2 or 3 touchdowns. You got to feel like Badger is going to account for at least one of them. Now, for Houston, they're in a very interesting predicament because they had their number one wide receiver, Matthew Golden, go down 2 weeks ago, and they've had to try to replace his snaps in production. Well, so far they haven't. What you've seen is that Brown and Manjack have kind of just continued on with the status quo. Both of them have been kind of boomer bust options so far this season. They haven't really changed who they are a whole lot from a statistical profile with Matthew Golden out of the lineup. And then you really haven't seen a third guy, develop and take that production from Golden either. So what you saw last week was that Dalton Carnes, who's only $3,500, he played more snaps, like significantly more snaps, had 3 catches for 44 yards against Oklahoma State. That's not doing much for you from a fantasy perspective. And you also had Jonah Wilson, who's a true freshman, who played just a little bit in that game. He didn't play a whole lot, but he caught 1 bomb for 60 yards and a touchdown against Oklahoma State. So it's really like an interesting scenario. If I'm playing Donovan Smith, I'm probably going to be stacking him with Brown or Manjack because of the security. But if you really need a punt play to fill out the rest of your lineup, you've got Wilson and Carnes there at $3,600 and $3,500 that you could do worse than them for punt plays. They're guys that are going to be on the field and showed last week that they can do a little bit with the football. Now, after that, UCF is their opponent in this game, and they're kind of a receiving core that is revolving around 2 guys, Javon Baker and Kobe Hudson. Javon Baker is going to, on a game-in, game-out basis, see more targets. He's got a higher floor, and he has had some big-time performances in this UCF offense. Kobe Hudson is the big play guy. If there's going to be any bombs or any situations where he makes one man miss and takes it the distance, that's going to be Kobe Hudson's thing. He's only $5,200. I think if you're playing GPPs and you're playing John Rice Plumley, or if you're playing Donovan Smith from the Houston side, you got to consider Kobe Hudson because all it would take is 1 or 2 of those big plays for him to instantly pay off value at a cheap price tag. Now, two more teams to talk about. Tennessee is next up. So we've talked about all show. Tennessee's projected 42 points. How the heck are they going to get there? Well, what we've seen in this offense in the last month has not been great. Brew McCoy, who is probably their best receiver in my opinion, has been out with a season-ending injury, and Dante Thornton Jr. recently got hurt with another season-ending injury. So, in the time since those two guys have been out, or really just since McCoy's been out, Squirrel White has led the team in targets. He operates out of the slot, which is where we saw Georgia kind of carve Vanderbilt up at times in their game against them. So I do think that Squirrel White does have some legitimate upside as the team's target leader. However, their big play guy is Ramel Keaton. And so, if they're going to put up 42 points and they do so by two bombs, and Keaton catches two bombs, and that's instantly going to pay off his cheap price tag at $4,300. And then with the Thornton injury, you have seen Chaz Nimrod. Yes, that's his real name, Nimrod. Increase in snap counts significantly. Had 5 catches for 44 yards last week against Georgia. $3,500. I think he's another one like Carnes and like Jonah Wilson for Houston. Not a bad punt option at only $3,500. Now, last guy we're going to talk about for this slate at wide receiver is going to be Devon Vele of Utah. And the reason why is because he's been quietly very good in the last month. He's had 3 straight games of over 22 fantasy points, and he's had at least 7 targets in all 3 of those games. And so I really like what we're seeing out of Devon Vele. This Utah passing offense has kind of started to come on strong lately, and he's been a big reason why. So I'm absolutely willing to go back to Devon Vele at only $5,000. And oh yeah, I didn't even mention the matchup yet. It's against Colorado. The only possible worry that you could have is if you think Travis Hunter is going to shadow him. However, it doesn't really seem to have had that big of an effect recently because Colorado has still been getting carved up through the air. All right, that does it for the wide receiver position, and that does it for this episode for Saturday, November 25th, 2023. This is the last big-time college football slate we've got this season before Conference Championship Week, and we will be back to cover all of it, so make sure you hit that subscribe button so that way you'll be notified when those episodes drop, as well as our weekly NFL and college football content. Also, if you like what you saw on YouTube, go ahead and hit that like button. It really helps me out a lot, and I really do appreciate it. If you're listening on audio, please rate and review. Again, it helps me out a lot. It helps the podcast, helps the videos get noticed, and I really do appreciate it. You guys are the best. If you want more from me, you can find me on X at Mike's Money Picks. Link to the Fantasy Corner Discord is in the description, and the Patreon, patreon.com/Mike's Money Picks. Link is in the description there as well. All right, that does it for this episode, y'all. So I'm going to go ahead and head on out of here. Best of luck to you guys for all your DFS endeavors Thanksgiving weekend, whether you're playing college football, college basketball, NFL, whatever. Best of luck to you. Hopefully I'm able to give you guys some information that'll help you win. Thank you guys for watching or listening, and I will see you next time.